Okay, so good morning. I want to begin by wishing everybody a Shana Tova, a Ksiva Chasima Tova, and a Shana Tova U'Mituka. We should have a sweet, happy new year. And it's been a wonderful year learning together, accomplishing, 300, and I guess this past year was a leap year, so 380 some dapim of learning together. And so looking forward to another year, God willing. This year's not a leap year, so that's 354 dapim roughly together. So looking forward to continuing our learning together. We are only about just under 2 years away from finishing Shas, so that's very, very exciting. And so looking forward to continuing that effort together. We are right now in the middle of Masechet Zevachim. We are on today's daf is daf Chet. We are at the bottom of daf Zayin and Mabet. We are at the two dots on the last of the narrow wide lines. And what we had said in our opening Mishnah is that there are we are supposed to have the right korban in mind, the right sacrifice in mind, when we do the various services associated with the sacrifice. In particular, 4 services that we focused on. That's the slaughtering of the animal, the receiving of the blood, the taking of the blood to the there's a copy that right there, that, yep. And then and you can just grab a chair. The taking of the blood to the altar, and then finally there is the oh, here, you can take it. And there you go. There you go. And there's the throwing of the blood on the altar. So those 4 services, again, slaughtering, receiving the blood, taking the blood to the altar, and throwing the blood on the altar, you need to have in mind the right sacrifice. We're at the bottom of Zayin Amabet. You have to have in mind the right sacrifice. Now, what happens if you don't have in mind the right sacrifice? Now, remarkably, when it comes to every korban other than the chatas and the Pesach offering offered in its time, the answer is it's okay. You didn't do the right thing, but do the rest of it the right way, and you'll be all right. That's we make mistakes and we continue. But when it comes to the chatas and the Pesach offering when it's offered on Erev Pesach at the right time. So then if you have in mind the wrong korban, well, then it is going to be invalid, and you just stop, and the rest of the animal gets thrown away effectively, and you don't get to do anything with it. Now, yesterday we learned about how do we know that that's true for the Pesach. Now, as we begin at the, again, last narrow line on Zayin Amabet, we begin by asking, how do we know that's true for the Chatas? Now, we've seen a number of these psukim already, because we've been talking about the need to have in mind the right intention, and we've been talking about the need to have in mind the right person. And so now we're going to get into those details with respect to the chatas. Now, last point of introduction is the fact that there are a number of types of chatas. There is the traditional chatas, which is offered from a female lamb or a goat, and that is, if one were to do a sin that is subject to a kares, and one did it inadvertently, but there are other sin offerings. Some other times that we offer a sin offering. So from the last Maseches Horios, we talked a lot about the Korban Ola V'Yored, which is also a sin offering that's offered for three specific sins. Specifically, if you're asked to testify and you lie falsely that you don't have any information, if you have a shvuas bitoy, an oath that you're going to do something or that something happened in the past and you swear falsely to that. So that's a second situation where you have a korban olav yored. And the third is if you eat kodesh when in a state of tuma, or you enter the Beis Hamikdash in a state of tuma. Again, all of these inadvertently. Well, I guess the first two may be intentional, but the last one is inadvertent. And so the point is that in each of those situations, you are going to be subject to this korban. And so that is a second kind of korban that we could have. A third kind of korban. Absolutely, is a yoledet, where one offers a sin offering. There, it's important to note that a yoledet doesn't just offer a sin offering. There's an ola as well. And then there is a sin offering of a mitzora and a zav and zava. Exactly. Now, the zav and zava, I think, is similar to the yoledes, but in any event, the bottom line is that we have these different kinds of sin offerings. They are going to come up in our conversation because we are going to note that because of the uniqueness of certain of these sin offerings, maybe we shouldn't be able to learn from one to another. But now we're going to begin again, bottom of Zion Amabet, last of the narrow lines, Chatas Minalan. How do I know that when it comes to a sin offering, you're not able to continue with it if you have in mind the wrong thing? Diksiv v'shachat osa l'chatas, that the line, he shall slaughter it as a chatas, which is a pasuk in Vayikra, Parak Dalid, Pasuk Lamed Gimel. Again, we've seen that pasuk a number of times throughout this Masechet already. So, Shedei Shchita L'Shem Chatas. The slaughtering has to be done for the point of view of it being a chatas. Now, Ashkechan Shchita, Kabbalah Minalan. Well, that clearly is talking about slaughtering. How about the other three processes? The receiving of the blood, the carrying of the blood, and the throwing of the blood. Now, remember that we saw already that the Chumash uses a language of receiving when it of taking, excuse me, when it's actually referring to receiving, and therefore receiving and taking are juxtaposed and connected to one another. And so if we have one of them, we will have the other. But in any event, right now we're asking about Kabbalah, receiving. So Diksiv, how do I know? Well, that we turn to the top of Chet Amud Aleph, V'lakach HaKohen midama chatas. He's going to take the blood. And Rashi tells us, top Rashi, we'll do a bunch of Rashi on this stuff, so you want to keep your finger on Rashi if you can. V'lakach HaKohen lashon kabbalahu. That language of the Kohen taking is a sort of language of receiving. Midama chatas shetehe kabbalah l'shem chatas. So as a result, the receiving needs to be for achatas. Again, the reference of, because the whole chapter, when I say chapter, I don't mean what the Christians call chapter in the Tanakh, but the whole parsha, the whole discussion, the whole paragraph in the Chumash is talking about chata. So why does it need to repeat that? It's telling us that you have to have it in mind. You have to have the right sacrifice in mind. So v'ashkechan shchita v'kabbalah. So all right, so now we found that you need to have in mind the right sacrifice when it comes to slaughtering and when it comes to receiving. Zrika minalan. How do I know about the throwing of the blood? Well, the Amar Kra, v'chiper alav hakohen michata, so that the Kohen is going to provide atonement for him through his sin offering. Shetehe kapara l'shem chatas. So the kapara, the atonement, has to be through the chatas. You have to have in the mind the sin offering. Now, how does referencing atonement mean anything? Well, we saw over the last week that in fact, what is the action with respect to the sin offering that creates and that causes the atonement, it is the throwing. And that's exactly what Rashi says, the chiper, that when it comes to the atonement, hainu bizrika, that is done through the throwing of the blood. Holacha, and then now, because we are done with the discussion of how we know you have to have in mind the right korban, Rashi answers the question that we might have in mind. How about halacha? We dealt with the slaughtering, the receiving, and the throwing, but we seem to have skipped out on the halacha. Halacha lo itzrich kra. We don't need a separate pasuk to tell us about taking it to the base, to taking it to the altar. To biklal kabbalah he mitrabialei, that based on the kabbalah, on the receiving, we already know that that's in fact going to be the case, and so that's the story. And so that is the situation. Okay, so Ashkechan
inherently part of the halacha is inherently part of the Kabbalah.
Exactly, because the Torah specifically used a language of holacha when it really meant Kabbalah. And so as a result, that is why we know it is in fact, in both of them are going to be included in one moment. So Ashkechan Shinoi Kodesh. So what have we found? So far, we found that you need to have in mind the right sacrifice when you're doing these steps. Shinoi ba'alim minalan. How do we know, in fact, that in fact you're not supposed to have in mind the wrong owner, that having in mind the wrong owner is going to be a problem? So Amar Kra Alav, the Torah says for him, and so as a result, that's the pasuk that we just cited, v'chiper alav hakohen, alav v'lo al chaveiro. It's got to be for his friend and not for somebody else. Well, Ashkechan lemitzvah. So
for his friend. No,
it's got to be for him and not for his friend.
No,
sorry. No, right, and not for his friend. I'm sorry. My oral slip up. So it has to be for him and not for his friend. So Ashkechan lemitzvah. So this all shows that just like when it came to every other sacrifice, you have to have in mind the right person. But what we need to now show that is different for achatas, la'akev menalan. How do I know that if you do make a mistake, it actually undermines the whole nature of the chatas? Because remember, we had these same drashot that required the same thing with respect to the shlamim, and we said with respect to the shlamim that and it applied to every other korban because v'zos haTorah, v'zos toras, v'zot Torah. The pasuk that we saw that in fact in Perek Zayin of Vayikra, we saw that in fact you need to have in mind the right thing for every korban. But what was different for every other korban is that we said that even if you do have in mind the wrong thing, meaning you do the wrong thing and you have in mind the wrong korban, it's still going to be valid. So how do I know that when it comes to the sin offering, that's not true? Because that's what our Mishnah told us. Kida Amar Rav Huna Brei de Rav Yoshua. So chataso, that based on the fact that the Torah could have said chatas, and this is in reference, this is in Bamidbar Vav Pasuk Tet Zayin, where it's talking about the Nazir's chatas, and it says chataso instead of chatas. So hachanami chatas chataso. So too, here when it comes to our regular chatas, since that one could have said chatas, it says instead chataso, so or v'chiper alav hakohen michataso. So as a result, because it says his chatas, it shows that you need to have the right person that in fact you need to have the right thing in mind. And if you don't, because of this repetition, that we don't need to have said this, because of this repetition, it means that it's only kosher if it's going to be for the right person and for the right sacrifice. So Ashkechan mitzvah b'shinoi kodesh, uzrika b'shinoi balim, bein la mitzvah, bein la akiv. Okay, well that implies, right? This is the language that we just cited from Rav Huna only really refers to having in mind the right owner. So far, we know that if you have in mind the wrong korban, you've done the wrong thing, but we don't know whether or not it's going to be ma'akev. But when it comes to, and similarly, but on the other hand, when it comes to the zrika, throwing the blood, when it comes to doing that for shinoi balim, when it comes to doing that and you do for the wrong owner, well, then bein lamitzvah, bein lakev. Then that we know is going to be ma'akev because the pasuk of v'chiper alav hakohen michataso is got a double aspect to it. It has alav and chataso. So as a result, that has two different teachings. So one is to teach us la mitzvah, and one is to teach us la akev. And that whole pasuk is about having in mind the right person, and specifically in connection with the action of throwing. And so as a result, that shows that you have to have in mind the right person with respect to throwing the blood. So now, what about the rest of it? La'akev b'kol avodos b'shinoi kodesh. What, instead of having in mind the wrong person, I have in mind the wrong sacrifice? How do I know that that is going to be ma'akev? Ubishar avodos b'shinoi balim bein lamitzvah bein la'akev. And how do I know that when it comes to the other services with respect to having in mind the wrong owner, that it's also going to be not just a mitzvah, but it's going to be la'akev. In fact, we have not even shown that it's even a mitzvah with respect to the other services when you have in mind the wrong owner. So minalan.
Mitzvah that say that give a korban in place of a
with the right intention. No, the mitzvah is having in mind the right intention with respect to bringing the chatas offering. So that's what we're trying to prove.
Is there mitzvah asay to bring a korban if one commits a sin?
Yes. Yes, that's exactly that. In fact, that is the mitzvah. But the point is that the mitzvah that we're referring to is not the underlying mitzvah of bringing the sacrifice. It's the terminology that the Gemara is using, that you have an affirmative requirement to use the right thing in mind. But that does not necessarily mean, as we saw with respect to the shlomim and all the other sacrifices, and anola, that it doesn't mean that you have to have that if you don't have it in mind, that it's going to be ma'akev. So that's a separate thing. So the Gemara is highlighting 2 points here. First is that you have to have the right thing in mind. And second is when it comes to the sin offering, if you don't have the right thing in mind, it's not even good. So it doesn't work. So that is the language of mitzvah, is the requirement to do it right, and the ma'akev is to say that if you don't do it right, it doesn't work. And because when it comes to other sacrifices, you don't have that ma'akev piece. It's only that if you don't do it right, it does still work. So Amar Rabbi Yonah. So how do I know about all of these other pieces? Because again, what we've shown is that it's a mitzvah with respect to having in mind the right korban at every stage. And we know that it's not just a mitzvah, but it is even a ma'akev if you have in mind the wrong person. But what about everything else? Meaning having in mind the wrong person when you do the sprinkling. We've learned that it's ma'akev. But what about having in mind the wrong person for the other things? And what about for the other steps, meaning the slaughtering, the receiving of the blood, and the taking of the blood, and the taking of the blood to the altar? And what about the ma'akev piece with respect to the all pieces of it, the sprinkling of the slaughtering, the receiving of the blood, the taking of the blood to the altar, and the throwing of the blood on the altar? So minalan, how do I know all that? So I'm Rabbi Yonah, asya mechatas nazir. We can learn it all from the sin offering of the nazir. Diksiv v'hikriv hakohen lifnei Hashem. That when it comes, we have another requirement that shows that you have to have in mind the right sacrifice, namely that it says in connection with this is again Bamidbar Vav Pasuk Tet Zayin, that you need to have in mind the right sacrifice. V'asa, and it uses the word asa. Sheyehu kol asiyosav l'shem chatas. All the actions, meaning the slaughtering, the receiving of the blood, the bringing of the blood to the altar, and the throwing of the blood, all four of those need to have in mind the right sacrifice. And so, as a result, that shows that it must be ma'akev. So, ashkechan shinoi kodesh. So, okay, you have now shown that with respect to the Nazir sacrifice, that it is ma'akev with respect to all four of the avodot, because it used the word aseh, which is a broad term that covers all four. But shinoi ba'alam minalan, how do I know about the change of the owner? So Amar Rav Huna, we skip the parentheses. Amar Rav Huna, braid to Rav Yoshua, chatas chataso. Well, that's what we said before. It says chatas, and it should be, and it doesn't need. It actually says chataso, and it could have said chatas. So that teaches us again, it has to be his chatas. So we have both the his chatas in the connection with the nazir and the his chatas in connection with the sin offering generally. So as a result, the double reference shows that it's got to be ma'akev there as well. So maskif la ravina elameata olas olaso my darashta bay darashas bay, meaning that same verse that we just cited ends v'asas chataso ve'es olaso. Well, maybe that means that the ola for the wrong person should also be puzzle. So Villaravina, minchas minchaso, nesek nisko, my darashta behu. But 1 second, we also have, the pasuk says in the next pasuk, va'asa kohen es minchaso ve'es nisko, that also there, the mincha offering and the nesek offering that is accompanying the ram that's offered by the nazir, also has the possessive in it. So why didn't he ask about those two sacrifices and suggest that meant that those also need to be done with the right person in mind, or they would be invalid? So hahumi baile min chasam v'niskehem balayla. No, just as we have a lesson from the fact that it says min chasam and niskehem, that it means that you can bring it at night. Min chasam v'niskehem afilu machar, and that because it says their mincha and their nisachim, it can be brought even the next day. This is referring, this reference to min chasam v'niskehem is in connection with the musaf sacrifice, and we say that with respect to a musaf sacrifice that you're able to bring it even, it occurs a couple of times in Bamidbar, Perek Kaftet, Pasuk Yud Chet, and Pasuk Kaf Aleph. This is in connection, I believe, with the Sukkot offerings. Mm-hmm. And so, as a result, the point is that this nature of their mincha and their nesach tells us that you don't just have to offer it on the same day as the musaf, but you can even offer it that night or even the next day. So similarly, when it comes to the mincha and the nesech of minchaso and nisko in connection with the offerings of a nazir's ram, those two can be offered even at night and even the next day. So Ella Ola, so we go back to our question that Ravina asked. Ella Olas Olaso, my darshas behu. So what do we do with this word Ola? Visu, mi gamri mahadadi, and moreover, can we actually learn from the Nazir's chatas over to every other chatas? No, we can't, because chatas chelev mechatas nazir lo gamra. We can't learn the chatas that one would bring, meaning an ordinary chatas that one would bring if one ate chelev for a chatas that a nazir brings. Shekain yesh imad damim acherim, because when it comes to the nazir's chatas, he has to bring other sacrifices, namely the ola sacrifices, along with the mincha and the sachim. So chatas nazir mechatas chelev lo gamra, and moreover, you can't learn it in the other direction. action, shekain kares, because when it comes to a chatas chelev, the person would have been subject to kares if he had done it intentionally, and that's not true with respect to nazir. There is no penalty of kares in connection with somebody who says that they're going to be a nazir and then finishes their nazirut period and now is becoming no longer a nazir. That's not. There's nothing to be done about that. It's not a kares-based sin. Ella amarava asya mechatas mitzora. All right, so let's instead try and learn it from the sin offering of the Metzora. Now, and so as a result, we'll show that when it comes to Shinoi Kodesh and Shinoi Balim, that it's all Ma'akev. Diksiv va'asaha kohen es hachatas. Again, we have the action verb, so that's going to cover all four of our main actions, and we have the word chatas, that it specifically needs to be a chatas. Shehu kol asiyosav l'shem chatas. All right, but all right, that does address the need with respect to at least the chatas of the Metzora, that it all needs to have the right action in mind, the right sacrifice in mind. But how do I know that you need to have the right person in mind? Well, Amar Kra, the chiper al hamitaher, that he's going to atone for the one being purified. Al hamitaher zeh v'lo al mitaher chaveiro, on this person who's being purified, not his friend. And so as a result, we know that you have to have in mind not only the right sacrifice, but the right person. And this pasuk is in Vayikra Perek Yudalid, pasuk Yutet. So va'akati mi yalfa mehadadi. But again, we ask the same question that undermined our ability to learn from the chatas of the nazir. Now we're going to say the same thing with respect to the chatas of the Metzora. How can we learn from it? Chatas chelim mechatas Metzora lo yalfa. We shouldn't be able to learn a sin offering, a regular sin offering, from the sin offering of a Metzora, because shekain yeshima dam macherim. Because just as the Nazir's sacrifice had other sacrifices with it, so too does the Metzora one. And chatas Metzora mechatas chelev lo gamra. And you can't learn the sin offering of the Metzora from the sin offering of a regular sin offering that's associated with having chelev. You also can't do it shekain kares, because it's subject to the penalty of kares. So mechada lo asya tesi chada mitarti. All right, so we can't learn one from another, but maybe we can learn one from the other two. Namely, we have three different chatases that we're referring to at this moment. We have the traditional chatas, that's the chatas that we refer to as the chatas chelev. There's the chatas Metzora, and there's the chatas nazir. Maybe we can combine two of them. And we are now going to try to look at all three possible combinations of two, and we're going to end up saying that none of them are going to work. So let's take a look. Behei lo lichto. So which one shouldn't be written? Lo lichtov rachmana bechatas chelev. All right, so let's start with not writing the chatas chelev. B'tesi mehanach, and we'll learn it from the other two. Well, malahana shekain yeshimam dam macherim. We already know that one's not going to work, because both the Metzora and the Nazir have other sacrifices with them, so you can't learn to the chelev from that. So lo lichtav rachmana b'chatas nazir. All right, so let's not write the chatas nazir, but tesi mehanach, and we'll learn it from the Metzora and the traditional one. So malahana shekain ein lahen she'ela. Well, one second, those other ones, when it comes to trying to get out of them, there's no possibility of asking a rabbi to undo your oath. But when it comes to a nazir, if you go ask a rabbi to undo your oath, then the whole obligation of bringing the korban nazir's chatas nazir is going to go away. And so that makes the chatas nazir unique, so you can't learn from the others to it. So lo lichtav rachmana b'chatas Metzora. Okay, so let's not
makes a neder, right? So he can go to a
correct, exactly. Muvhak, exactly right. So lo lichtav rachmana b'chatas Metzora. So all right. So we'll keep the reference to the nazir and the traditional, and Vitesi Mahanach, and we'll learn the Mitzorah from the other two. So Mala Hanach Shekain Ein Ban Bedolos. But one second, the Mitzorah's Chatas has something unique to it. That if you're a poor person, there's a lower cost option that's available, so that you can't learn from the others to it. So Ella Amar Kra Zos HaTorah LaOla LaMincha. So the pasuk that we've already used to teach us that the rules by the Shlomim apply to everything else, we're going to also use that now in connection with the Chatas. So Hikishu HaKasav L'Shlomim, because that pasuk does mention that pasuk Vayikra Zion, pasuk Lamed Zion, does mention a Chatas in it. So it connects all of the different kinds of sacrifices. And now this derivation is a little complicated, so pay attention, and if it's not clear, we'll go over it. So mash lamim ben shinoi kodesh ben shinoi balim be'inan lishma mitzvah. When it comes to the shlamim, we say that all of the services are exactly the same, that you need to have in mind both the right sacrifice and the right owner. But that is only lemitzvah. It is not lema'akev. But yet, the whole rule with respect to all four services is identical. So chatas bein shinoi kodesh, bein shinoi balim, beinan lishman lemitzvah. And so similarly too, the sin offering of also, whether it's with respect to having in mind the right sacrifice or having in mind the right ownership, you need to have it to be lishma. You need to have the right intention, the right owner, and the right korban. And again, it teaches us the mitzvah component. And so as a result, hilkach mitzvah mishlamim. And so as a result, we already have the first learning, the first teaching, which tells us that it's a mitzvah, that we actually affirmatively have to have in mind the right person and the right sacrifice. We learn it all from Shlomim. And so now the verses that we originally were using all this time to teach us about the fact that it's ma'akev, v'hana krai la'akev, now that there was a mitzvah, now we can use those psukim, the same psukim that says chatas, chataso, etc., all those psukim that we've cited so far on today's daf. Those psukim we can now use to say that not only is it a mitzvah, but it's also ma'akev. And therefore, if you don't do the right thing, if you have in mind the wrong sacrifice, or you have in mind the wrong person, when it comes to a chatas, it's going to be invalid.
But aren't we saying in this pasuk that shlamim is not ma'akev, right?
Correct.
So how do you learn that chata is ma'akev?
That's exactly why this lesson is complicated, and that I was trying to highlight it ahead of time. The point is that from this pasuk of Zos HaTorah, that pasuk is teaching us only that the shinoi kodesh and shinoi balim is a mitzvah. It is not teaching us it's ma'akev, because you're right, it can't teach us it's ma'akev because it's not ma'akev with respect to shlamim. But it teaches us that we already have the ma'akev, the mitzvah elements for a chatas. And that means that when it comes to a chatas, you need to have in mind the right person at every step. You need to have in mind the right sacrifice at every step. Now, how do I know that it's actually also going to be ma'akev? Well, that's because all of the psukim that we cited so far today. So again, when we said at the very beginning, how do we know that shchita is a problem? Well, we said v'shachat osal chatas. So now we had used that at the beginning of today to tell us that it was a mitzvah to have in mind the right sacrifice. But now we can use that pasuk to tell us it's ma'akev. And similarly for each of the other steps, when we said v'lakach hakohen midam chatas, we had originally said that tells us that the receiving and the bringing of the blood needs to be is a mitzvah, that it needs to be, you have to have in mind the right sacrifice. But now that we learned that we have the mitzvah from Shlomim, we can use that pasuk to tell us it has to be ma'akev. And so on and so on. And so now all the verses, we had learned everything, but we had only learned everything is a mitzvah. But now that we learned from Shlomim that there's already a mitzvah to have in mind the right person and the right sacrifice when you do all of the steps with respect to a chatas, all of those psukim can now be used to teach us not only do you have to have in mind the right person and the right sacrifice, but if you don't have them in mind, it all doesn't work. It's ma'akev.
So, okay, so
So-
those pasukim are being used to teach us ma'akev.
Exactly.
But are we also saying they're being used to teach us the mitzvah? Because-
No. The
Okay.
mitzvah
Because
is
you can't
just
often can't learn two things from one
exactly.
pasuk.
The mitzvah is just being learned
From
from
Zot Torah.
Shlomim. Zot Torah. Exactly.
Zot Torah.
Exactly. Okay. So va'ashechan chatas chelev. So diksiv ba lechatas. Okay. So 1 second. So we've got when it comes to the sin offering, the regular sin offering, we said that it says lechatas for a chatas. So chatas da avodas kachavim. So okay, we're done with the traditional sin offering. But now, what about chatas da avodas kochavim? Because we haven't even talked about that one. That's a different kind of sin offering that we haven't mentioned. And one of the ones that we did mention at the very beginning, but we haven't touched on it yet today. And what about the korban olav yored of chatas offering, which is for when you are asked to testify and you swear falsely, or you make a false oath, or you bring tuma to the Beis Hamikdash, or you eat something in a state of tuma, eat something kodesh in a state of tuma. It doesn't specifically have, and we don't have any pasuk to learn for those sin offerings. Minalan, how do I know about them? So chatas da avodas kochavim asya mechatas chelev. We can learn the sin offering of idolatry from the sin offering of chelev, of a traditional sin offering shekain kares kamoso, because it's got kares. They're both subject to the penalty of kares. V'hanach kuli asam bima chatzad, and all those other sin offerings can be learned from a tzad hashava, that a combination of multiple things. So Rashi tells us, walks us through all of these combinations. So let's take a look at Rashi 6 lines down in the narrow lines on Chet Amud Bet. Asyan b'mahatzad. So mechatas chelev, v'chatas nazir umitzora. We can learn namely the korban olav yored sin offerings. We can learn them from a combination of the sin offering for chelev, the traditional sin offering, and the sin offerings of the nazir and the mitzora. Deki parachta malachatas chelev shekain kares. That when it comes to your question, 1 second, we're going to have a problem, because how can we learn from a sin offering of chelev, which is subject to kares? Because after all, the chatas of the korban olav yored is not a kares based sin offering. So chatas nazar matzora yochichu. So we can use the nazar and the mitzora. Those are also not subject to kares. So we can use that. And malachatas nazar umitzora shekain yeshimam dam macherim. Oh, you want to say that it's a problem to learn from the chatas of the nazar and the mitzora because they come with other sacrifices, and the korban olav yored doesn't come with other sacrifices. Well, chatas chelev tochiach. Well, the traditional sin offering will come and show that everything's okay. So atzara shava shebehen, and what's the commonality between the two, etc., etc. And so as a result, the commonality is that it's a korban chatas, and you have to have in mind the right person and the right sacrifice. So afani avi chatas deshmias hakol umechatas chelev. Excuse me. Afani avi chatas deshmias kol. And so similarly, I will say with respect to the sin offering for making the false oath with respect to testimony, that somebody asks you to testify on their behalf, and you say you don't know anything, and you swear to that fact, so you'll bring this korban olav yored as well. It needs to have in mind the right sacrifice and the right person. So now, Rashi continues, and now you might be wondering, well, maybe we could learn from the chalev and one of either mitzora or the nazir. Well, that Rashi tells us doesn't work. Because if you try to learn it from just the chalev and the nazir, because those two don't have an option to have a cheaper version. But Tomar b'shvuas b'itoy shehi ba'olav yored. But could you say that about a shvuas b'itoy? No, because a shvuas b'itoy has an option of a less expensive version. And imechatas chalev v'chatas mitzora. And if you wanted to try and get it just from the chalev and the mitzora, where the mitzora has a cheaper version. Well, those two have no option of undoing them by asking a rabbi about it. Tomar but at least two of the three carbon olav involve an oath. And the oath could be undone and thereby undermine the whole need to have a sin offering. And so as a result, that fact is true with respect to both the Nazir situation and the Bitoy and Shmias Kol situation. And so as a result, if we don't use both, all three of the traditional chatas, the chatas of the Nazir and the chatas of the Mitzora, we won't be able to learn out the Karban Olav Yoretz of the other three of the three sins of the false oath, the hearing the voice and of asking for testimony, and the Tuma of the Beis Hamikdash. Okay.
You can't learn which from which now.
So let's start with what we actually are learning. What we're actually learning is the Karban Olav Yored. We are learning that from the traditional Chatas plus the Chatas Mitzora plus the Chatas Nazir.
All of them in one package.
All three of those together are what allows us to learn to the Karban Olav Yored. And what Rashi was saying is you can't do it from just two of those three. You can't use two of the traditional chatas, the chatas mitzora and the chatas nazir, and use two of them to tell you about chatas olav yored. You have to use all three of them. And now that we use all three of them, we can say that we have a tzad hashava, and therefore just as those three require having in mind the right owner, having in mind the right sacrifice for all the different steps, so too with respect to the Karban Olav Yored, you have to have in mind the right owner, and you have to have in mind the right Karban. And if you don't, in both situations, it's ma'akev, and the whole sacrifice is invalid.
So all four of them.
All four of them. And not only that, but we've also learned, because we can learn from the traditional chatas to the chatas of Avodah Zarah, we've also learned about the chatas of Avodah Zarah. So we basically covered almost the entire waterfront. And so we've gotten all the major chatas offerings that an individual would bring, and now we're good. We've shown that every sin offering is going to require you have in mind the right person, you have in mind the right sacrifice, and not only do you have to do it, just like you have to do that for every other korban, not only is it a mitzvah, but it's ma'akev. If you don't do it, the sin offering is invalid.
And where did we learn the Mitzora again? Where did we learn
the Mitzora? We had
and the Nazir. From where did we learn that?
So that we did over the course of our learning together. I believe it was from the Chataso, from the Psukim, Va'asas Chataso ve'ezolaso in connection with the Nazir. And when it came to the Mitzora, it's from Psukim. It was also from Psukim.
And the Chalev is also from the Psukim.
And the Chalev is also from Psukim. All those others we've learned from Psukim. Right. It's just now that we are learning the Karban Olav Yored and the Karban Chatas of idolatry, of Avodah Zarah. Those we are learning from the other ones. Exactly. Okay, so back to the Pesach. So we said now we're going to talk about the Pesach and a little bit of timing. We're at the two dots at the top of Chet Amud Bet. So Tanu Rabbanan, Pesach bismano lishmo kasher shelo lishmo pasul. That if this is basically almost obvious that if you have in mind the right korban at the right time, then it's going to be, this is exactly what was said effectively in our Mishnah, that you have to have in mind the right korban, then it's kosher. If you have in mind the wrong korban, then it's going to be pasul.
Don't we say it's a shlamim? Becomes a shlamim?
No, that's the next line. Ubishar Yemos Hashana. If you do it any other time, if you do it on Erev Pesach, when you're supposed to be shechting the Pesach, and you have in mind the wrong korban, it does not turn into a shlamim. It's pasul. But when you do a Pesach offering at any other time, when it's not the Tarban time of the Pesach, well then, Lishmo Pasul. If you have in mind the Pesach, well, it's not Pesach, so you can't offer it, so that's going to be Pasul. But Shelo Lishmo Kasher. But if instead you were to have in mind that you mean to do a Shlamim, then it's going to be a Shlamim. And we'll see that it means even if you have in mind a different Korban, not a Shlamim.
Well,
So,
if he had in mind on Hanukkah, this is it was a Pesach, a Pesco.
Yeah, Paschal lamb.
Right. So on Hanukkah, he says, no, then it becomes a shlamim.
Yep, exactly. We're gonna see that right now. So we're not specifically about Hanukkah, but yes. How do we know that all this is true? So Amar Avoa, the Shmuel's father said, Amar Kra, v'im min hatzon karbano, l'zevach shlamim la'Hashem. So if the sacrifice is from sheep, so or from one of the smaller animals, so zevach shlamim la'Hashem, it's going to be a shlamim for Hashem. So the problem is this pasuk, Vayikra Perek Gimel pasuk Vav. So davar haba min hatzon yehi l'zevach shlamim. This teaches us that something that is coming from sheep, that is specifically limited to the small animals, namely the sheep and the goat, and not from the bulls, and not from the oxen, is going to be a shlamim. And so what is that referring to? This is a hint to say that it's the Korban Pesach is actually a shlamim. So ema shlamim in midiakrina lo. Well, okay, but doesn't that, maybe that should mean that only if I have in mind a shlamim when I offer the Korban Pesach at the wrong time will it be a valid shlamim. But maybe if I have in mind an ola, it won't be a shlamim, it'll be an ola. So Amar Rabbi Elab, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, lizevach l'rabos kol zevach. Well, that pasuk that we just cited, the im min hatzon karbano lezevach shlamim yit la'Hashem. So the word zevach there is coming to tell you that any sacrifice that's in your mind will result in it being a shlamim. Now, of course, they're about to ask what I think is the obvious question. Well, ema kol deshachas lehevi kamosa. Well, maybe when you have in mind an ola, it should become an ola. How do you know that it's going to become a shlamim? So, I hava ksiv l'shlamim v'zevach v'kedeka amart. If it had said for the shlamim and the sacrifice rather than zevach shlamim, you would be right, because then it would be telling you that the purpose is the outcome. But now, hashdiksiv lizevach shlamim, it's telling us that it concludes with the word shlamim. So the outcome will be always a shlamim, but the zevach, the generality of the reference, is telling you what you had in mind. So even though you had in mind a different korban, it's going to end up being a shlamim. L'kol deshachet le shlamim leheve. That whatever you slaughter it for, it's going to be a shlamim. Well, 1 second.
So he has in mind it's a Pesach, but it's at the wrong time, it becomes a shlamim.
So if you have in mind, if you bring a Pesach, and now you have in mind and it's a Korban Pesach, it's a Paschal lamb that you set aside for Pesach, and now it's 2 days after Pesach, and you bring that sacrifice. Whatever you have in mind, it ends up turning into a shlamim.
Because it's not at the right time.
Because it's not at the right time. Exactly.
There is no right time for an ola, though.
No, there's no right time for an Ola, but the point is that you set it aside as a Pesach
Oh,
offering,
okay,
right?
okay.
That's the key. The
Right.
key is that you
But
set
I
it aside
thought
as
you
a
just asked, suppose we
No,
said
but
it
what if you,
normally.
no, not if what you set aside as an Ola. What if you had in mind an Ola?
Oh, okay.
And maybe you might have thought that it should become an Ola. And so that's what we're learning. We're saying, no, it doesn't become an Ola. You could have in mind an Ola. You could have in mind a Mincha. You could have in mind whatever sacrifice you have in mind. The bottom line is it turns into a Shlomim. And that's what it's going to be.
Because you brought it as a
Because
Pesach.
it was set aside as a
As a
Pesach, and a Pesach is a subset effectively of Shlomim. And so as a result, it turns into a Shlomim. So Emel Zevach Klal Shlomim Prat. And so maybe we should say that there's a Klal of Prat here, that we have a generalization, then we have a specification, and we know that whenever you have a generalization and a specification, klal prat, ein beklal elamash prat. We don't include, we ignore the generalization and focus solely on the specification. And so that would mean shlomim in midiachrina lo. And that would mean that if you offered a shlomim, it would work if you have in mind a shlamim, but if you have in mind anything else, if you have in mind an ola, it won't work. So no, it's not actually a klal prat. La Hashem hadar v'chalal. That the pasuk concludes with Lashem. That the next word, in fact, is Lashem. The pasuk is v'im minatzon karbano lezevach shlamim lahashem. So as a result, that tells us we have a generalization again. Well, when second Maskef lo Rabbi Yaakov ben Pekod, as we saw, Rabbi Yaakov ben Pekod asked this question a few days ago. Halo dami klala basra l'klala kama. But the generalization at the beginning was about a korban, and the generalization at the end was more general. The first generalization only includes other sacrifices, but klala barasra laHashem kol de laHashem, anything that's offered to Hashem, vafilu laofos vafilu menachos, any kind of mincha or bird offering would be covered in that regard. So and according to Rabbi Yaakov from Nahar Code, that kind of klal or product klal doesn't work. You need the same klal both before and after. So hatana debe Rabbi Yishmael beklale upratik darish laki hide gavna. Well, no, the Tana of Rabbi Yishmael's academy does learn that kind of klal product klal, and therefore we're going to be fine. And klal product klal iatadan elakaina prat. That if you have a klal product klal, we use the prat as in order to specify the generalization, and so therefore we're going to be specific in that regard. So ma prat before shehu shelo lishmo v'kasher av kol shehu shelo lishmo v'kasher. So too, anything's got to be. It's clearly slaughtered for it's not for something else. It's going to be kosher. So too, whatever you were to do, not for its own sake, it's going to be kosher. So ima prat meforish davar haba beneder v'nedava. But one second, maybe we could say that it's got to be something that you could bring with a neder or a nedava. Av kol haba beneder v'nedava. Ola ushlamim in chatas v'asham lo. So if you have in mind a sin offering or an asham, it would be invalid and it wouldn't turn into a shlamim. Ela lezevach rebuyahu. No, the point is that the zevach comes to be expansive. But so in second, so then it should be that whatever offering it was, maybe it should again become whatever the offering was for. So Rabbi Avin Dochen Kachim Hanechalim El Eitzel Kachim Hanechalim. Well, it can only go to convert from one kind of eaten sacrifice to another. We're not going to allow this Pesach offering, which was supposed to be eaten, to turn into a sacrifice that was not supposed to be eaten, which is like a sin offering or an asham. But one second, or an ola. But on second, though, one second, though, exactly, the Kamara's question. Kohanim do eat those sacrifices, at least two of them, the sin offering and the asham. So maybe we should say that they turn into a sin offering or an asham. No, Eladochen kacham anechel mechol adam eitzel kacham anechel mechol adam. No, we're going to change it from something that's eaten by everybody to something else that's eaten by everybody. Ve'ein dochen kacham anechel mechol adam eitzel kacham she'ein anechel mechol adam. And we're not going to change it to something that is eaten by everybody and to something that is not eaten by everybody. That's answer number one. Answer number two, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Avin Omer, dochen kachim kalim eitzel kachim kalim. No, we're going to change a one of the kachim kalim, the lesser holy versions of sacrifices, to another lesser holy version of sacrifices, which excludes the ola, the chatas, and the asham, which are all considered kachim kodshe kachim. Ve'ein dochen kachim kalim eitzel kachim kachim. And we're not going to change something that is kachim kalim to something that's kachim kachim. And so now we've explained how it is that we know that when we bring the sacrifice of Pesach, not on its time, it's going to turn into a shlomim. And so we'll, God willing, pick up from there, God willing, tomorrow with a series of objections. So what are those objections? Stay tuned for tomorrow's daf. Wishing everybody Shana Tova. Again, Aksiva Chasima Tova.